G'day everybody, we have James Hughes here on Future Day. That's Future Day in America, we've just had Future Day in Australia. But yeah, I spoke to James yesterday and asked if he'd like to do a short interview with me, and here we are. So I'll hand you over to James. So what are your thoughts on using Future Day as a ritual to focus on the future instead of just the past?
Well, I really like the idea of Future Day. There are, of course, a number of examples in the United States of different kinds of holidays being invented over the last couple decades, from things like Black History Month, Martin Luther King's birthday. But I think one of my favorites has been Earth Day, which is, as opposed to almost all holidays, almost all institutionalized days of remembrance, are about remembering things in the past. And Earth Day is one of the few that has been a successful institutionalization of thinking about the future of this planet and our relationship to it. And I think we need more of that kind of future institutionalization of future-mindedness in our culture. And it's kind of surprising to me that it was, as a religious sociologist, or sociologist of religion, that you look at how much attention religions give to future events, and even almost all of their holidays are about the death and birth of religious figures in the past, and not about reflecting on future events or the expected future events. One of the kinds of future events, or the ways of thinking about the future, that I think we need to be doing more of, and that I've been spending an increasing amount of time talking about in the last couple of years, is about the future of work and our economy. And I think it illustrates how difficult it is for people to break out of the paradigms, the very recently inherited paradigms of imagine radically different ways of living. It's only been a couple hundred years that people got up every day thinking, I have to earn dollars in order to buy food, and that's why I'm going to go and be paid to do a particular kind of labor. That's not the way that almost all of our ancestors got up in the morning and imagined what they had to do during the day. They had relationships with people, they learned skills from their parents and their relatives, they were part of social groups that had obligations to one another, and they did what they had to do to survive. But this kind of commodification, and a sense that you basically were only worth something if you could get somebody to pay you to do something, that's very recent. And so when you try to tell people, look, it may be that in the very near future, lots of people are going to lose their jobs because of automation, and we could still have a wonderful, prosperous society. It's just that fewer and fewer people are going to be paid to do work. People freak out. They can't really wrap their mind around what kind of a future that would be. So I think that's just a small example in my recent work of how difficult it is for people to imagine the future. So setting aside one day a year for us to systematically try to together imagine radically different ways that things could go in the future, dystopian, utopian, the whole gamut, I think is a very important exercise.
Yeah, it seems like the automation may make it much easier for the suppliers of the means to labour to actually transfer these tasks that normal humans do today to computers or AI or robotics. And it seems the Industrial Revolution often will push people out of cottage industries and into factories. You see old pictures of people driving horse and plough, and these days you see there's a massive 200 horsepower plough and maybe one person in the picture instead of dozens. The machinery seems to be taking over a lot of the jobs. However, we've migrated from the sort of the physical means of labour, often generally, to a more intellectual means of providing utility. Where do we go from intellect if we have autonomous agents that can provide that service, those
Right.
types of services?
Right. I think we've reached a fundamental tipping point in the political economy where in the past you could generate profits by investing in a ratio of capital and labor that still involved substantial investments in labor. And the tipping point is that today in almost every sector the productivity and profits that you get from investing in capital, that is technology, information infrastructure, robotics, and so forth, is expanding, and human labor is becoming more and more expensive, and not increasing at all in its productivity, maybe a little bit. And so, as a consequence, no matter what we do in terms of educating our workforce or trying to find new sectors for people to work in or whatever, it's always going to be the case that the robots and the AI and everything are getting better and better and allowing people to do more and more with fewer and fewer people. And that's just something that that political economists from left to right have not wrapped their mind around. And there is an old tradition in, speaking of Future Day, one of the first efforts in the West to create novel holidays and a novel way of thinking about the future was the French Revolution. The French revolutionaries created a new calendar, a new 10-day week, and so forth. And they had holidays that were very future-oriented. And around that time, people did begin to think about, what happens when this automation of agricultural labor continues, and fewer and fewer people are needed on the farm. They thought at the time that it would mean that eventually people wouldn't have to work. They didn't imagine. Those in the 18th century didn't imagine the expansion and the possibilities of industrial labor. And then when industrial labor began to be automated, then people said, well, now people are going to be left out of work. And they were wrong, because they didn't imagine the expansion of human services and intellectual labor and so forth. But now, as you say, one of the questions we have to be asking ourselves is there any place for us to go after this, right? And for me, one of the most important books on this is Sex and Love with Robots by Adam Levy, because he points to how in the coming few decades, we're going to have robots that have the emotive responsiveness, that have the tactile capacities to be the perfect, one of the quintessential things that we imagine only human beings can do, to be a successful lover and a sexual object. That robots may be better at it than human beings. That you would, for people who, especially people who are pressed for time or too ugly or too disabled or too crazy or whatever to have a real human lover, a robot lover may be the only option for a lot of those people. But even those who have all the options of human lovers may prefer these alternatives. So you imagine every domain, taking care of old folks, planting trees. There's no domain of human labor possible where it will be immune from automation, AI, robotics.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the points that was brought up at the Australian Future Day last night was maybe the only, similar to what you said, maybe one of the only domains where we'll be experts in is being human. And then I said, well, do you think that'll create a new industry for maybe teaching people how to be more human?
Well, I don't see
maybe
a lot
the
of
robots
humans
could do that better than us.
I don't see a lot of humans going to zoos to learn how to be more chimp. It's like that. I don't think that there's going to be a huge market in robots who necessarily want to learn how to be human. It's like they're not all going to hire us to be their tutors and companions. That's the kind of data from Star Trek. One of the things that annoyed me immensely about Star Trek Next Generation was Data had the Cinderella or the Pinocchio complex, that he wasn't satisfied being a robot, he wanted to be a human. But we are experts at being human, for whatever that's worth. Maybe, but therein lies part of the answer, is that we may need to get over being human as well. We may need to find how to merge with our technology in order to stay ahead of these trends.
Okay, well, current humanism in its current form, is it equipped to deal with these types of issues that we're heading into, like the issues of automation and mass unemployment and the need for social safety nets?
Well, humanism is a pretty broad term. It's applied to all kinds of things in the past, and so yes, I do think that some form of humanism could be useful here. More, what I think about is the need for us to have a cultural and psychological reformation and get over the capitalist imposed ideas about how to find meaning in our lives. The notion that it's only, for instance, it's only very recently that women thought that you had to be an employed member of the labor force in order to have a meaningful life. Most of them thought that in the past, thought that it was perfectly okay. Many of them did have employed labor in the 18th, 19th centuries, or participated in agricultural labor or whatever. But often women in the past were not participating in the paid labor force when men were, and that was perfectly fine. They were perfectly adapted to the notion that you could have a meaningful life and be a worthwhile human being and be a mother and create a home. And we're going to have to make a similar adjustment, that getting up in the morning and saying, what I'm really going to do today is paint or write poetry or take care of my garden, or whatever things attract us in our lives. Those have to be the things that will provide us meaning in the future. Now, but the other thing, of course, is there's going to be a huge political struggle, because we have to create the new political and economic institutions that will make sure that everyone has equitable access to the largesse of an automated economy and world, and that that wealth is not sequestered into the hands of the very, very few, and the rest of us have to be the kind of feudalist peons and or surplus mouths that get fed or not at their whim. And that's, I think, the dystopian possibility. And so we need to have a very serious political struggle in the coming decades to make sure that that doesn't happen.
It sounds ominous. And like as the current suppliers to the means of labour, or the means of employment, there's really not a lot of people compared to the amount of people in the world who need to find some form of need to work for money, or work for that to provide some form of utility for money. So yeah, how do you think this will come about? First of all, how far away do you think we are from having to deal with these issues, and how do you think we'll have to deal with them?
Well, the United States, I haven't looked at the labor force statistics around the world, but the United States passed peak employment in the year 2000. Since the year 2000, there's been a steady decline in the percentage of the population who participate in the paid workforce. And I think that is going to accelerate, that decline is going to accelerate rapidly as automation, AI begin to accelerate in turn. The other dynamic here is that the world population, and especially the population of the industrialized North, is going to get older and older. And so long as we have expectations of retirement and laws and traditions around when people retire, that of course is under pressure now, because people are going to be healthier longer, and a lot of those things are going to be up for negotiation. But nonetheless, we already know that demographic trends are pointed towards increasing proportions of the population not working and being dependent on the working parts of the population to pay into the social welfare system. And that's going to put, whether automation happens or not, that's going to be putting the social welfare systems of all countries under an enormous amount of stress. Once you combine that with the probable decline of employment under the impact of automation and globalization. Globalization is just the shifting of jobs around the world, but globalization is going to have a disproportionate impact on declining employment in the North. And then robotics. Then, the situation just becomes explosive, and I think it becomes explosive in the next couple of decades.
Wow. Um, yeah, it's going to be an interesting next couple of decades. So, well, talk about social safety nets. What do we have today that resembles anything like what you think we'll need tomorrow?
Well, what
Or
we
at least,
ultimately need is not only the social safety nets of universal education and universal health care, but we need a universal basic income. One of at the very least, we need to replace the notion of people going on welfare if they're unemployed or having unemployment benefits or disability benefits or pensions. We need to replace those different forms of taking care of folks in different situations with the notion of a universal basic income guarantee. And it could be more for families that have children, of course, and less for those that don't. Or there can be ways of modifying it, but it makes enormous amounts of sense from a public policy point of view not to have 20 different ways of taking care of people who can't take care of themselves, and to have it be a basic part of the social contract. If you look at the United States situation, Medicare is a universal entitlement of health care for everyone over the age of 65. It's well funded, it's very popular, it's never going to go away. Medicaid is a healthcare entitlement just for the poor. And as a consequence, every state underfunds it. Doctors who participate in it only get a third as much. It's much less politically popular because it's stigmatized as just being for the poor, as opposed to being a universal entitlement. So the struggle for universal entitlement to income, I think, is a central thing that we have to struggle for. But more broadly, the concept is that we have to defend what we call the social wage, the notion that because we are, human persons existing in this planet, that we have obligations to one another to ensure that we don't starve in the streets, and that we get educated, and that we have enough to eat, and that we have someplace to live, and so forth. And whatever the systems are for ensuring that, we have to defend them. Right now, there's an enormous push for austerity coming from the right, motivated by the economic crisis, at least the economic crisis that affected the North. It didn't affect the South quite as much. And so from all across Europe and now in the United States, we're just entering into what's called the sequester, which is a new form of austerity for us. We have to push back against all that kind of austerity because it's pushing us in exactly the wrong direction from where we need to be going to anticipate these future trends.
it's interesting, but I think part of the humanness that part of our humanness is the want to is status. It's the want and the desire to have forms of status symbols around us. There's an iPhone app. I think it's called I'm Rich, and it costs like $800, and all it is just like a flag to say that you had enough money to buy an app that does nothing but say that you're rich. How are we going to appease these sorts of desires, these sorts of motives in the future, if we have radical abundance and everybody has access to everything, or if we have some form of social safety net where everybody's got an income guarantee?
Well, it's certainly not attractive to me that we would have complete equality of outcome. I mean, I don't think, in the first place, I don't think it's ever going to be an attractive political program to eliminate all private property, all private production and sale of goods. So, if someone's a popular artist and they sell their stuff and other people buy their stuff with stuff, and the popular artist becomes rich on the basis of that in that society, I think we're always going to want that kind of success to be possible. What we probably will become increasingly leery of, and should be leery of, is the notion that corporate CEOs are worth, 500 million times as much as the average person, and that their contribution to the economy is worth, them basically being wealthier than Titan. I think that kind of disparities of wealth are obscene, and will become more extreme when that kind of wealth allows you not only to buy, yachts and planes and whatever, but also extra years of life extra IQ points, really the possibility for the bifurcation of the human race between the super wealthy, entitled, and the rest of us will become more extreme in the future. And so we for a variety of reasons, need to have an egalitarian policy that reins those kinds of extremes in. But the notion that you or I might have, that you might have twice as much income because you're working twice as hard, and I imagine that in the future that will probably be the case, knowing your work habits, in that kind of a future, I think we would all want you to be compensated in recognition of the contribution that you make to society. Now, when people have fewer and fewer opportunities to make things and to get paid for things in that future world because of robotic and automation and so forth, what forms of things will they work for? What forms of things might people be motivated by, status and so forth? Well, one is just to have a job. If only a quarter of the population has access to a paid job, getting a job itself is going to be a pretty, and you can see that already in certain society like Spain or someplace with a very high unemployment rate. It's a pretty lucrative. It's a motivating factor, to go to school and to make the sacrifices necessary just to get a job. So that's going to be motivating for some humans for some period of time. And then there's going to be other forms of status, being recognized as having made intellectual contributions, artistic contributions, perhaps being a colonist, making a contribution by being some of the first people to travel to the moon and Mars and establishing our colonies there. Military service, I think, will probably always need some soldiers, but also ecological restoration projects. I mean, I'm sure that robots will be able to do a lot, but that we'll have a lot of restoration to do in the wake of climate change and the depredations that's opening up the tundra of the warming Soviet North to farming, and the Canadian North, as it warms up and becomes arable land. There are going to be farmers needed up there. So I think there are always going to be things that people can do and aspire to, and new adventures to be had.
Yeah, in the long run, I imagine the simple task of providing some forms of novelty, even though maybe we have like AI or intelligent agents that might be able to do it a lot faster and a lot more efficient than us, we can still do that, whatever that may be.
Yeah, video game design might become an increasingly attractive job.
Going back to Earth Day, you mentioned, we spoke earlier, and you mentioned that your mother knew some of the people who kicked off Earth Day. I think maybe there's quite a bit that we could learn about Future Day by looking at how Earth Day got off the ground. Although the terrain has changed since then, it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on Earth Day.
Well, I mean, obviously the success of Earth Day was keyed to the growth of the environmental movement, the ecological movement, and that in turn was motivated by the recognition of things like pollution and pesticides and nuclear waste, a number of the different anxieties that had emerged in the 1960s and 70s to really give wind to the sails of the environmental movement. So I think the parallel lesson there is that for us as future-oriented policy advocates or futurists or transhumanists or whatever we call ourselves, for us to get people to think more seriously and about the future, about foresight, and institutionalizing that into our politics and our culture is the first step by growing our movements. The transhumanist movement, futurism as a subculture, and then encouraging this holiday as a part of that is kind of an institutionalization that it becomes natural. If you think about the function of religious holidays. It's a celebration within a religion. It's as much of it is a statement to anybody else. It's something that you look forward to all year to say, I am a member of this religion and I participate in this particular culture. Although secularization of those things happens as well. So at any rate, I'd say not to worry so much about the growth of Future Day, although let's do that as well, but to focus on the growth of our movements and the important work that we're doing and the issues that we're trying to address.
Definitely. So, yeah. I had a question before. So, what are your thoughts then? I mean, if we can, in as much as we can, develop Future Day and move it forward, and maybe it can be sort of like a flag that you don't need to be a transhumanist or a singularitarian or even a futurist professionally to do. Do you think it's something that other businesses can adopt? A bit of foresight strategy and around a meeting room table once a year.
I like that. There's also, I hooked up last year with a network of futurist middle school organizations here in the States. And they have future scenario building exercises throughout the year. And then they come together for regional and national debates about futurist topics and policy-oriented conclusions from those debates. And then they come together for an international meeting. So it starts there, I think, in the K through 12 education system of encouraging kids to think seriously about the future, their own future. But yes, of course, in the business setting, having an annual retreat and having it be both a review of your previous, successes and failures, and then part of that be oriented to the future. I'm not sure Future Day would necessarily sell as a corporate idea, but it could be tied together, I suppose.
Yeah, perhaps you're right. It's hard to know how the sort of meme will take off, or how the sort of Future Day will take off based on the way it's sort of framed at the moment. Yeah, I guess it's a bit of an experiment at the moment, for sure.
Well,
see how
I'm really glad you're pushing it. It's a good experiment.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
What to add today? Well, I'm looking out at a bright, sunny, but still snowy day here in Connecticut, and I guess all throughout the winter, my mind returns frequently to climate change. We had some big mega storms here in the eastern part of the United States this last couple months, and I think one of the reasons that people will be thinking increasingly about both Earth Day and hopefully Future Day is the instability of the climate, and trying to look forward about what the next couple of decades might bring and how to prepare for it. So it's a very timely exercise that you're engaged in.
Yeah, thanks. And yeah, I'm appreciative of your engagement too. So yeah, I did a couple of interviews with Ben yesterday, and they went online, and now they're in an article on H Plus magazine. So yeah, it's all good. Anyway, yeah, so I'll stop the interview part. Thanks very much for your time, and yeah, I'll look forward to catching up with you in the future.